Okay, thanks so much, everybody, for jumping on tonight. I want to start by acknowledging that we're all calling in from stolen land. I'm in Ganj in Brisbane on the land of the Aga and Turrbal people and pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this week is the anniversary of invasion and that sovereignty was never ceded and that we need to work together towards a treaty in all areas, including as we develop renewable energy. So what's going to happen tonight is we're going to talk about renewable regulation in Queensland. So it's been a focus of work for QCC over the past couple of years to build renewable energy quickly and well. And we're very grateful tonight to have Naeem Santoso Miller from the Environmental Defender's Office calling in. Naeem is a senior solicitor based in Gimoy in far north Queensland. He's been advising communities and supporting them to push back against inappropriate development for over 6 years. And he's going to explain some of the planning frameworks that we have in Queensland. So, yeah, thanks everybody for jumping on to listen to this. If you want to put your name and where you're calling in from in the chat, like Steph has demonstrated, that would be great. How this is going to work is I'll give a bit of an overview of where we're at. Naeem's going to give us a bit of a 101 of renewables planning in Queensland. And then I'll talk a bit more to the proposed changes from the new government, and then we'll have time for questions. So if you think of a question while you're listening to us, please pop it in the chat. We'll be watching that and be able to record them. And when we get to the end, we'll have a discussion. We can ask you to unmute if you're able to and ask the question so that we can answer as many as possible. But before then, if you can stay on mute, that would be great, just to make sure we don't get any background noise. So let's get into it. I haven't followed my slides yet, but there's still time. So where we are in Queensland with renewable regulation, some important events in the past year being that in April, the Labor government legislated a renewable energy target and renewable energy zone framework, which the LNP in opposition did not vote for. Then in September, just before the election, the Labor government released an update to State Code 23 for wind farms and a draft Renewables Regulatory Framework, both of which we will talk through in more detail. In October, we had the election. We have an LNP government. Key players are David Janetsky as Treasurer and Energy Minister and Jared Bligh as Deputy Premier and Planning Minister. In December, we saw an extension of the Renewables Regulatory Framework consultation by the Energy Department until the 1st of February. So that is this coming Sunday. And just last week, while this consultation is still ongoing, we saw announcements from the Planning Department under Bligh to propose a call-in of the recently approved Moonlight Range wind farm and direct the department to stop work assessing 3 other wind farms that have recently gone into the State Assessment and Referral Agency. So what we're expecting from here is that the LNP government will repeal the renewable energy targets and that they will introduce some form of legislation to change the way that renewables are regulated, but it's still an evolving space of between particularly those two departments of how that plays out. And while all this is happening, we've been in a heat wave in Queensland, and in January, half of our coal units have unexpectedly been offline at some point. And these 6 that are on this graph here have been offline for nearly 20% of the month. And that's been putting a lot of pressure on Queensland's electricity grid, particularly after sunsets. And we need to see more generation capacity and more storage, which the LNP don't really have a plan for either. So it's all fun and games in the Queensland energy market at the moment. And we will talk in more detail about some of these proposed changes. But I'm going to throw to Naeem now to give us a bit of an overview of how renewables are regulated in Queensland.
Thanks, Claire. There's going to be a lot of information thrown at you guys in about 10 minutes in a very short time frame, but we do have time for questions at the end. So if you want questions as I go, make sure you put them in the chat, and then we can go back to them, circle back to them at the end. So approvals 101. Renewable projects may need approvals under a variety of legislation and are all assessed individually on an ad hoc first in best dress basis, which is why the draft Renewables Framework is an important opportunity to ensure that all the various assessments are done in a transparent, efficient and thorough way. Before we get into the draft framework, we'll start with a broad brush development approvals 101 before narrowing down into renewable projects specifically. Approvals under the Planning Act are really focused on land use. So the real question is when making decision on the Planning Act is is this development an appropriate use of the land? Before anything else, is this the thing that we want to have in that location? Broadly, development is categorized into 3 kinds. The first is prohibited development, which is not allowed under any circumstance. The second is accepted, which can just happen anytime without a permit. And the third is accessible development, which does require an approval. Accessible development is then again split into 2 kinds, code accessible and impact accessible. Code accessible development will be assessed against a code and doesn't require public consultation. A code typically has 2 sides. The first is accepted outcomes, which is a set criteria to be considered compliant. So this is almost like basically a minimum standard. The second side of a code is performance outcomes. Now, these outcomes are flexible and focused on the end result. For a simple example of the differences between the two, an accepted outcome for building height might be a building must be no taller than 8 meters. So to be compliant, a building must be less than 8 meters. While a performance outcome might say a building height does not affect the scenic amenity of an area. So a building that is 9 meters tall will not be compliant with an accepted outcome, but might comply with performance outcome if the building is surrounded by 10-meter tall trees. So the height of the building doesn't really stick out like a sore thumb. With code accessible, it's up to the decision maker to determine whether a development that fails to meet the acceptable outcomes meets the performance outcomes. And even if it doesn't meet the acceptable or the performance outcomes, it can still be approved if it is consistent with the overall purpose and intention of the code. Decision makers under code accessible can impose conditions for the development to ensure that it meets the performance outcomes. And one of the big things about code accessible is that the decision maker must approve the development with such conditions. So there's no leeway under the Act for a decision maker to refuse an application if conditions can be imposed to ensure that the development meets performance outcomes. The other assessment type of accessible development is impact assessment. Impact assessment is assessed against the same matters as code assessments, but there's an additional any other relevant matters. So this means impact assessment is unbounded, as the assessment manager is able to conduct the assessment against any factor they consider relevant. And they've got the discretion to refuse the application, even if it complies with the assessment benchmarks with the code. Or alternatively, could approve an application, even where it does not meet the relevant code, if they've got sufficient reasons to, such as like the community planning need to have that type of development, or the code is outdated and there's better science. Impact assessment must be publicly notified for at least 15 business days, and provides a right to make submissions and also the right for submitters to appeal a development decision in court. Impact assessment will generally result in better outcomes, as a decision maker gets a broad range of information from community sources, can consider a greater range of factors, and is held accountable through public appeal rights in court. Can you pop to my next slide, please, Claire? Thank you. So with the Framework for Renewables, the Planning Act and regulation sets out for each type of development who the decision maker is, what type of assessment is required, and what they are to consider when making that decision. So in our state planning system, we have two levels of decision makers. Generally, the local government will be the decision maker for developments, and they will consider development applications against their local planning schemes. And the other level is, of course, state level, which is only for a select categories of development outlined in Schedule 10 of the Planning Act. These are things that the state has an interest in or are beyond the technical capabilities of a local government to assess. So some examples include clearing of native vegetation, contaminated land, fisheries, heritage places, and relevantly wind farms. And our last level, of course, is our federal laws, which sits over the top of state assessment. So this is an additional level. A project must be referred for assessment under the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act if there are likely to be significant impacts on a matter of national environmental significance. So these are threatened species, World Heritage Areas. Now, if there are likely to be significant impacts, the development will be determined to be a controlled action, and the Federal Minister for Environment will then have to decide what level of assessment is required and whether to refuse the project or approve it with or without conditions. There is public notification during the referral stage for all projects, but may not be a public submission process in the assessment stage, depending on the type of assessment. So depending on the impacts predicted on the project, there will be levels of assessment, and the lower ones don't have public notification and submission rights. Next slide, please, Claire. As I said earlier, wind farms are an identified state interest, and they get assessed by the State Referral and Assessment Agency under what we call State Code 23. Now, as Claire said earlier, last year we received an updated Code 23, which has new performance outcomes to protect protected wildlife, as well as birds and bats, habitats in areas of high ecological value. There's also protections for water quality against erosion, runoff, bank stability, and requirements for offsets and progressive rehabilitation. If you'd like to know more about those changes to the wind farm code, I'm just going to plug the website of QCC member group CAFNEC, the Cairns and Far North Environment Centre, who have a great webinar recorded there. And that's also why I'm not going to go into too strong of details there, because we've already got that great resource. So State Code 23 consists entirely of performance outcomes. Which means they're all results based and very flexible and open to be conditioned for compliance approval. So there's no accepted outcomes which have that minimum standard in there. As code accessible, there's no requirement for community consultation, and there's also no community appeal rights. There is an updated guidelines for the wind farm code, which strongly encourage community consultation, but that guidelines are non-statutory document and not enforceable. So at the moment, code accessible wind farms, no public rights. Sorry, next slide, please, Claire. Solar power developments. So unlike wind farms, solar projects are assessed by local government under the local planning scheme. Whether a solar project is code or impact accessible will depend on the local planning scheme. So it's actually really difficult to say how they are assessed, as it's going to vary from local government area. I'm not personally aware of any local planning schemes that have a code for solar projects. So the vast majority of solar projects will be impact accessible. The state government has published non-statutory guidelines to assist local governments in assessing the impacts of solar farms, including the loss of agricultural land, glare, visual amenity issues, stormwater flooding, as well as a second guideline for developers and community about what to expect about these projects and how that consultation should occur. Now, that's a lot of complexity for a local government to decide on, and something that really needs more regulation on the state level. And that really highlights the need for why renewable energy zones, which are part of this draft framework, if we have renewable energy zones which identify areas where it is appropriate to have renewable production, local governments can be assisted in incorporating those areas into their planning schemes and create codes of assessment for projects to be sited where they should be sited. This also makes it harder for developments to occur outside of those designated areas, because if it's outside that area, it'll be impact accessible. And as part of that impact assessment, the developer will have to justify why they are building in this area outside the designated zone. So that's just one of the opportunities there, particularly around solar farms. We'll pop the next slide. Without going on forever, here's a list of some of the other approvals that are outside the planning approvals that renewable projects might require. All of these approvals have their own supporting regulations, guidelines, or policies. The draft Renewables Framework is an opportunity to ensure that all of these approvals align. Some of these changes proposed in the framework include under the Vegetation Management Act, making renewable projects a relevant purpose designation for vegetation clearing. This is a bit concerning because that allows a special vegetation clearing code for renewable developments, and they will allow clearing in areas where previously they might not have been allowed. While these codes do, however, generally have protections built in, such as a need to avoid and minimize in certain areas, and hard area limits of that clearing is allowed. Another one under the Electricity Act, one of the considerations to get a permit to connect to the grid is having a good social license. There's a proposed code of conduct for developers to engage with the community. So if we don't follow that code and go that engagement process, you're not likely to be allowed to connect to the grid. And another one just to spotlight is there's been talk of designating renewable projects as environmentally relevant activities, similar to resource activities. So if this were to happen, it would mean renewables would be require assessment under the Environmental Protection Act, which has an environment focus, which is good, rather than a land focus like the Planning Act does. But what would likely happen in that case would be the creation of a set standard of construction, operating, and decommissioning conditions to which all renewable projects would need to comply with as part of getting an environmental authority. So if they agree with those conditions, those standard conditions, they will automatically get an environmental authority. But if a project wants individually tailored conditions, like for example, they might not be able to comply with a particular standard, then that's when impact assessment will be required. But that's if they go the environmental protection route. My last slide is ministerial call-ins. So as Claire said earlier, the Deputy Premier and Minister for State Development and Planning has called in the Moonlight Range Wind Farm and issued a direction to stop the assessment of 3 other wind projects. So under Section 91 of the Planning Act, the Minister for Planning can call in an application that involves a state interest. A state interest is anything that the minister considers to affect an economic or environmental interest of the state. So that's a pretty broad definition. The effect of a call-in is that the minister effectively takes over from the decision maker and makes the decision instead. There is a public submission process. However, unlike impact assessment, there's no public right to appeal the call-in decision for the minister. And if there was an appeal ongoing, it would cancel that appeal. So if something was before the courts and the minister wanted to call it in and make the decision, they could. and that decision will effectively be final. So if there's been something that's been called in, like the Moonlight Range Wind Farm, make sure you put your submission in if you want the minister to consider the information that you want to put forward. The other thing is ministerial direction. So that one's under Section 95, and the minister can give a direction to decision makers to exercise a function to not decide an application, decide an application, impose a condition, basically tell them anything to do within their power what to do. There's no requirement for any public notice. All they have to do is put a notice in the Gazette, and it's already happened at that point. So there's no consultation, no requirement to consider any material. It's incredibly discretionary and up to the minister. So those sort of really discretionary ministerial powers are built into our Planning Act. And they're there as a political tool for ministers to, if there's something that is really strongly willed politically, that's a power that the ministers can wield. And that's Planning 101, crash course in 15 minutes.
Thanks so much, Naeem. It's a lot to get your head around, and I really appreciate you coming along. And yeah, again, just get your questions into the chat when I am. I'm just going to go through a little bit what is proposed in the draft Renewable Regulatory Framework that we've mentioned before then. So we had a webinar on the 7th of November that went through in more detail what changes were proposed. We'll send a link to that in the follow-up email to this. But when I went to look at the webinar recording today, I realized that I am sitting in the same place with the same shirt, but I've had a haircut, so you can track the passage of time. Don't worry, you haven't been sucked into a time warp. So what we're asking for from the LNP government now, we're still holding on hope to maintain the direction, at least, of the renewable energy targets, and particularly the funding allocated to build renewable energy in the budget. We want them to rapidly come up with an alternative energy plan to secure our energy future after our coal-fired power stations start to retire, and to keep the renewable energy zone framework rolling. So as Naeem mentioned, there's a lot of opportunities in that regional planning that we'll go through a little bit more that we want to keep seeing rolled out and to improve the planning regulations and progress mapping of where renewable energy should go. And the reason, obviously, that we want to see this renewable energy built rapidly is to take action on climate change. That was this month's depressing coral reef story. We're watching the impacts, and we need to be able to address them. So in the draft renewable regulatory framework, the good things that we liked in it was that there is a focus on strategic regional planning. So the Office of the Coordinator General, for example, is getting involved in looking at regions on environment on a regional scale and how to coordinate protection and cumulative impact management within renewable energy zones at the same time as the state government is progressing bioregional planning under the EPBC reforms. There's also a commitment to trialling a pooled benefit sharing fund in the Callide region with $5 million of seed funding. So that's the theory that all these projects will give back to their communities some funding. And if those are pooled and strategically invested, there's long-term benefits for that region beyond a new barbecue for the hall. The one potentially that I'm most excited about is having an information portal so that you don't have to trawl the SARA website anymore and can get easier access to when projects are being proposed and updated as well as some funding for broad education on the need to build renewable energy and the processes involved. And as Naeem mentioned, develop a code of conduct that is potentially applied at the generation authority stage. So those are things that are in train and likely to continue. There's also some things that were proposed in it that we would like to see investigated. So an expanded role for the Department of Environment, setting a minimum benefit for projects to mandate an amount that they should provide back to their community, formalising bonds for decommissioning so that landholders are not left with the cost of cleaning up a site if it has to be decommissioned. And more broadly, consultant support for landholders to deal with the tax and legal implications, as well as a complaint escalation pathway for landholders and neighbours. There's also investigation into circular economy, and one of the projects being piloted is a collection for rooftop solar panels that's being trialled in some places in southeast Queensland at the moment by the Smart Energy Council, who will be attending our webinar next week to tell us more about that project and how they're working on filling in that logistics hole so that solar panels can be recycled. But there's still things missing in this plan. The key one is the bioregional planning to map areas of biodiversity and provide guidance to developers on where they should develop. This is a photo of Megan Scanlon and Tanya Plibersek signing the MOU to do that bioregional planning back in 2022 that we still haven't seen delivered. We also want to see some more investment and concrete proposals to improve First Nations engagement. The First Nations Clean Energy Network and First Nations Clean Energy Strategy have provided a lot of good ideas on how that could happen to improve ownership and benefits and inclusion of First Nations within the renewable energy development. So we want to see that. And broadly a way to do that regional planning to manage cumulative impacts. What the rhetoric from the government has been so far, from the LNP government, has been around equity in regulation so that renewable energy is assessed in a similar way to mining. A couple of concerns about that. One is that we have a bunch of concerns about how mining approvals function and don't protect nature or communities very well. And the other is that renewables and minerals are defined very different legally in our system. So under the tenure system for minerals, landholders actually do not own those minerals and cannot say no to development occurring on their land. Whereas renewables cannot proceed unless there is an agreement from the landholder. So from the starting point, they're not the same, and so we don't think that that's the focus. And what we want to see is actually, renewables being planned to protect nature and deliver benefits for communities. On the impact assessment point, if that is brought in, we think that there should be a threshold of environmental impact above which that impact assessment is applied, so that smaller projects, which are more likely to have landholder agreement, potentially be supported by the community, are able to be progressed. So what can you do about it? The first one is make a submission to the draft Renewables Regulatory Framework by Sunday, the 1st of February. We'll send a follow-up email tomorrow with the recording to this and also a link to our draft submission so that you can get ideas. And if you are with a group that would, with a member group of QCC that would like to sign on, then please let me know. The proposal to call in the Moonlight Range wind farm is out for consultation as well until the 14th of March. You can also make a submission on that. Steph is going to drop some of these links in the chat as we're going. We also have an email you can send to David Janetsky, the Energy Minister and Treasurer, calling for a well-planned renewable transition so that he knows that people in Queensland support the continued rollout of renewable energy. And you can come to next week's webinar, which is going to be on Wednesday, the 5th of February at 6 p.m, same time, on better practice renewable energy. So we will have, as I mentioned, the Smart Energy Council talking about their pilot to improve recycling of rooftop solar panels. We will have the Community Power Agency talking about the work that they're doing, particularly in the New England region of New South Wales, to improve biodiversity and community engagement in renewables. And the Renewable Energy Alliance talking about how we could build local energy hubs to support communities through the transition. So that's the real whistle-stop tour of where we are in terms of renewables regulations and where we're going. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open up for questions. I haven't really been able to follow the chat very successfully while sharing my screen, but Steph, is there a question that you can kick us off with, or someone who's asked a question you can kick off?
Yeah, sorry, this Zoom thing is kind of okay, great. So Joe Barkworth asked a question. Joe, are you able to come off mute to ask that?
Hi. Yeah, it's just that first part about impact assessment where there had to be a 15-day public consultation. I was just wondering whether the 15 days had to be in a row, because I had a feeling that I'd seen a planning application where it seemed that the public consultation seemed to come and go. That was more of a local thing. So I was just wondering whether they can effectively make the consultation very awkward, because they'll do a few days here and then a few days there and then another few days, and it totals 15 days. 15 days doesn't sound very long either, to be honest.
Naeem, do you want to take that?
Yeah, that is a weird one. There's nothing expressly saying it can't, but it would be very poor form. Generally, you'd at least 15 business days. It should be a continuous period. Yeah, I can't ever imagine it not being a continuous period if it's a notice under the Planning Act. It could be that there is consultation that's not a notice under the Planning Act, and they could do it over a smaller period. But if it's a notice for an impact assessment under the Planning Act, it should be 15 days continuous, and it's 15 business days, so 3 weeks, not just 2 and a bit weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Paul, do you have a question about the differences between types of assessment? Do you want to ask that?
Yeah, before I go there, can I just ask, who decides which category project falls under prohibited, accepted, accessible? Who makes that decision?
Yeah, so under the planning regulations, it's actually built into the regulations. So the planning regulations have a table in there, I think it's in Schedule 2, which will have the development type, and then it'll say in that table who the assessment manager is and what it is to be assessed against. So even with your local planning scheme, say in your normal suburb, your residential zone, there'll be a table in your planning scheme that'll say what each development type, how it should be assessed. So if someone wanted to build a house in the normal residential zone, it'll say housing development, one a single occupancy dwelling, for example, and it'll say acceptable development, or it'll say code accessible. As long as you comply with this code, it's fine. But it might further down, it might say something like a shopping centre, in which case, if it's a low density residential development, it might say impact accessible. So it's built into either the planning scheme if it's going to be assessed by local government, or into our state regulations.
But someone's got to make that.
Yeah, so our politicians, when they make those laws,
Right.
so our politicians for our state will pass the law and put it into our subordinate legislation, which is our regulations.
Right.
And for local planning schemes, it's your council will change the planning scheme.
Okay. Yeah, so the question I had was about is the framework that we have for renewables, is that comparable with what we've got, for fossil fuel developments? I'm just curious as to whether it's a level playing field between the two, and I accept that, fossil fuels are underground, so the rights to it are with the state. Whereas with the renewables, you're talking about, occupying, surface land, where the landowner has the rights.
Yeah, so by fossil fuel development, do you mean like mining?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Mining or coal seam gas, for example.
A resource activity, extraction. You've hit the nail on the head. The major difference is that for mineral resources, there is that right to the state, and it is a bit of a separate system because land tenement and mining rights are sort of separate, and the landholder doesn't really have the same rights to refuse access to their land for access under a mining tenement, while for renewable energy projects, it's got to be agreement with the landholder. That said, mining projects are environmental relevant activities, which renewable projects aren't. So they actually have to go through a environmental authority process. So they may make application, and that's generally impact accessible. So there is a process to getting your mining lease and to getting a environmental authority, which has public submission rights, which has merits assessment. You'll go through the land court if there are objectors. While renewable projects, because they don't have that assessment under the EPA, under the Environmental Protection Act, it's only under the Planning Act. And because like wind farms are code accessible, there's no public appeal rights. So renewables actually have it a lot easier than fossil fuel developments at the moment.
Thanks, Liam. And David Arthur had a good question. Are you able to come off mute and ask that, David?
There we are. Good evening. Thanks for this. My question was, well, if renewables or renewable developments above ground are subject to these additional regs, how about transmission lines and other infrastructure up to and including, I suppose, energy storage systems such as pumped hydro?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Transmission lines are a bit of a special case because our transmission grid is state-owned, and as a state agency, they've actually got a lot more rights in terms of being able to gain easements and access onto land, and are exempt from a lot of regulations in that regard. Batteries, pumped hydro projects, they all have their own separate approval processes, but in terms of connecting to the grid, they still have to get a generation authority, same as a renewable project will. If a hydro project involves creating a dam or inundating an area, there are extra approvals needed for that under the EPA, but also under the Planning Act, and they're most likely going to be impact accessible. Batteries are a bit different because they're sort of considered an industrial use. So a battery in an industrial area might even actually be code accessible, but it really just depends on the local planning scheme. So the framework is essentially the same, but every different type of development will have a different type of assessment because, you know, they have fundamentally different impacts a lot of the time. And it would be inappropriate to sort of consider them all the same.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I think what that's looking like at the moment for pumped hydro and batteries is that batteries are being impact assessed under local council planning schemes. And pumped hydro predominantly have been declared coordinated projects and go through that kind of bilateral process between the Federal Environmental Protection Act and the state in the same way that a really large port or other infrastructure development would. I also had a question from Kerry. Do you want to come off mute, Kerry, and ask that? If not, I will just
Yeah,
ask.
I've got a question about, calling in that what it was Moonlight Project or whatever. What was the reasoning given for that?
What was the reason given for calling it in?
Yeah.
Yeah, that it hadn't been appropriately assessed for the impacts that it would have on the community and the environment, essentially. So it now has a public notification and submission period on the kind of entire impact of it beyond what is assessed as performance outcomes under State Code 23, and particularly that community consultation part. Kerry's question, given he's got no mic, is can the minister withdraw approval for a project that had been previously approved if it's called in?
Yeah, the call-in power is incredibly broad. The minister can remake a decision that's already been made. If that's going to occur, it generally occurs very quickly because there is sort of sovereign risk and bad politics in revoking approvals that have been out for a while. But it is very much within a minister's power to say that the decision was wrong and they're remaking the decision as they believe it should be.
Yeah, thanks. And I think for context on Moonlight Range, it got approved by SARA in early December, so it's fairly recent.
Tom, do you have your hand up for a question? I think I see.
Yes, I do. Recently, our Rockhampton Regional Council knocked back a BESS installation down at Baldercombe. It was vote taken by the council. I think it was 3 yes and 4 no's, something like that. My question is, what is Australia is a community of communities, and why can one little group of people hold back a development that is for the greater good of people?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one in our system of democracy, unfortunately. The reality is that we have to have a decision-making framework, and that framework will put the power in certain people's hands. With our system of democratic representative democracy, you hope that the people that are in those positions of power that we elect make the correct decisions. But that's essentially why, because, that is our system. And if we had a different system, I don't want to posit other ways of governing, but that's just how we do it. Sorry, I have a better answer for you than that.
Yeah, thanks, Naim. And Michelle had a question about renewable energy zones. Do you want to come off mute and ask that?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Oh, you're breaking up a bit, but give it a go.
You can hear me?
Yep.
All right, yeah. Well, have they been decided or is this still in progress?
So the renewable energy legislation that passed in April last year set up the legal infrastructure for renewable energy zones to be declared. So that includes more ability for Powerlink to make decisions within those renewable energy zones, and the idea of them in terms of requiring conditions like complying with the developer code of conduct to get a generation authority within that zone, the strategic mapping and community benefit pooling is within the renewable energy framework and rolling out. But what we don't have yet is actually where they will be. So they've earmarked 12 locations around Queensland, but they don't yet have a boundary or even really close to indicative boundary of what that will look like. So we're still a little bit away from seeing the first renewable energy zone declared and seeing that roll into action. The Callide renewable energy zone, so around Billawheeler, is likely to be the first one declared, but and as we understand was quite close to being declared, but before the election, but is now in a bit of reconfiguration around what the new government direction on these regulations and more broadly the renewable energy zone framework is.
All right, yeah. Well, I think I've just flicked into the link to the feedback, and there is something there about. And I mean, I must say it's the first time I've heard about this feedback being due so soon. I don't know if UCC have promoted it much, but I've been really concerned. So my main concern is I think a lot of us is that renewables are proposed not being proposed in environmentally sensitive areas. So
yeah,
how do we what's your hope in that space? Or what do we need to be doing with these submissions, or can you just sort of comment on that? Because I think for a lot of us in the environment space, I'm in koala conservation. That's we obviously want renewable rollout, but we don't want sensitive ecosystems impacted either. So to me, that's the core issue from my perspective.
Yeah.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the core reason that we're seeing renewable projects be proposed in areas of high biodiversity is because our planning frameworks don't protect nature. So that's why we have been advocating for changes like this to happen. What we would really like to see is bioregional planning implemented as proposed by the federal government, so that areas are mapped as high biodiversity value that should be protected, and developers have more certainty as to where they will be approved or not. There's the other part of that is accelerating the renewable energy zones so that the cumulative impacts of projects within a region can be managed, and we make sure there's corridors and connectivity of habitat maintained, so that we can have a renewable energy industry and biodiversity. And yeah, so that's, I think, those two
Okay.
frameworks. And
Yeah.
I think, Jonathan, do you want to ask a question that flows quite nicely from this about the EPBC reforms?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of fuss about the EPBC, which obviously is not doing the job of protecting our environment. And there was talk about it being, we made submissions, made things. This is the federal government, of course. What happened to that? I think they just walked away from it, or were there any modifications made? What is the status of the EPBC now, and what can we do to improve it?
Yeah, great question. And the EPBC reforms from the federal government, stage 2, which was the nature repair bill, was introduced to Parliament in November. It did not pass. Parliament got withdrawn by Albanese in November. We still think that there's a possibility that it will pass with amendments and be a major step forward in February. And that's why we're organising a rally tomorrow in Brisbane to try to get that up the agenda of federal politicians, and also have email actions, going to email your MPs, because it's really critical. This next sitting session in February could be the last chance for the federal government to pass those reforms, and that's what they're calling stage 2. So it would be creation of an environmental protection agency, an environmental information body, which are good, but would also necessary to pass to pave the way for stage 3, which includes new standards like bioregional planning. That is where we think we would really see benefits for managing development from housing down here in southeast Queensland to renewables around the state. So that's where that is. I was going to ask a question from Kerry. Did you have a question? And then we'll come back to David, who's already asked one.
Yes, I just asked what's happening with Forest Wind Farm up near Tin Can Bay. A couple of years ago, I heard the Australian Conservation Foundation group I was in, we had a presentation about that, and it looked really promising because it was in an exotic pine forest. So I thought that sounded good. But at the end of last year, I was up in the area and there was all these signs saying no wind farm, no wind farm. And there sounds like it's still dragging on. So I just wondered what's happening.
Yeah, I think primarily why it went quiet for several years was around funding for the company, and a general slowdown in renewable energy build that has now picked up again. They have started community consultation and more detailed design of that. There are environmental concerns around some of the creek crossings that remain in that plantation, and particularly the transmission line that would connect from Forest Wind across to the grid near the Barumba pumped hydro proposal. But that area has also seen a lot of opposition to transmission lines for Barumba because of impact on landholders and their property rights, and that's what I understand is driving a lot of that sentiment around there. But the company is still progressing it, but they haven't got to another stage of formal application yet. We've got time for one last question. I'll throw back to David Arthur.
Can I make an observation before that?
Sure, I can't see who that is, but sure.
One of the weaknesses of our current system is that we look at projects on a piecemeal basis. And that's why we've ended up with 3 LNG plants on Gladstone on the island, when all we needed was one. And government is the one that has to play that coordinating role to try and ensure that we optimize our developments, as opposed to this, capitalist, free-for-all, piecemeal. We should be balancing renewables against fossil. So these projects are feeding into energy, right? We should be looking at that as an integrated whole, fossil fuel projects versus renewables, and judging them, using kind of criteria, rather than doing this piecemeal approach, which is just so inefficient.
Yeah, and I think that's a key reason why the renewable energy zones idea is attractive, because it does take a more regional approach to planning, and that's also the reason that bioregional planning and that mapping was proposed under EPBC reforms, because the nature protection laws that we have are just watching individual projects get approved without considering the cumulative impacts, and that is what we need to change for sure.
Right.
I have one more piece of news. Sorry to interrupt, but we're going to get, by the looks of it, a pumped hydro scheme happening at from Youngler Dam. It's a 12-something gigawatt hour plant. It's now with the Coordinator General in, I think, Queensland. And I'm just concerned that this is going to be another one of those projects that'll be called in. It's a really good project. It has a dam already. It just needs construction of a secondary dam, and it'll be an incredible piece of infrastructure for Queensland. Sorry, but if you've got thoughts on that, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I think that, like I said, the pumped hydros, particularly the bigger ones, are going through a coordinated project pathway, which, because they are big infrastructure projects involving a lot of earthworks and a lot of impact. And so they automatically, most of them have gone to the Coordinator General to do a coordinated assessment between the state and federal governments. And so, there's several projects going through there that we're waiting to see more information on the environmental impacts that they might have through that process. Okay. I've said I'll do it. So final question from David, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Question to, I guess, Naeem. You mentioned earlier about it being a bad look to revoke approved developments. Well, we've had a bit of an issue here where someone gets a development in their back pocket, gets the DA approved, and then they sort of sell the land. They weren't interested in developing it themselves. They were just interested in sort of boosting their profit from the sale of the property. Would it not be better, I'm thinking, and meanwhile, science changes. Once upon a time, they'd approved developments on wetlands because they figured, well, that wetland doesn't matter. Nowadays, we think they're gold. But still the wetlands are being drained. So would it not be better to actually have a finite, a sunset or a deadline, a sunset clause on projects. Namely, if you don't commence your project by such and such a date, it's off. Would that be an idea? Are there many problems?
There's no real problems with that, and that's actually implemented in a lot of approvals for bigger projects. So almost all development permits, whether it's for a house or a shed or for a casino, will have a currency period where that development will end. And they say if you haven't progressed with that, then you have to submit a new application or you ask for an extension. So for smaller developments, it tends to be 3 to 5 years. For bigger developments, it can be 10 years. There has been sort of an acknowledgement by the state government more recently that some of the approvals have been too long, and that we do have these developments that have been sitting there for a long time and not really progressing. And so there have been some changes, I think it was 2 years ago, to some of the environmental authorities and for some of the coordinated general reports, that those reports have a currency period of only 5 years. I will have to double check at 5 years, but at the moment I believe it's 5 years. Don't fully quote me on that, but it has changed in legislation that instead of an open-ended period for those reports, that they can only be relied on for a set period of time now. So as you said, like science advances, and so approvals based on the best science at the time may not be good approvals further down the track. And so there has been an acknowledgement in the last couple of years, and it has been implemented. But really, because of any development application does have a currency period, it always has the option for the council at the time, or whoever the decision maker is, to extend the currency period. And so when we get these zombie developments that were approved under old planning schemes from 10 years ago, it's really up to a political decision and putting pressure on the council to say, you've got to make that call to say, no, you have to put in a new application, or that's not an acceptable development anymore, and we're not going to re-extend it. So like it's there in our framework, but it's just up to the will of the decision maker to ensure that it doesn't continually get extended.
It still sounds like a long time, 5 years. One would expect that you'd have certain milestones that you approve, conditional milestones that have to be achieved by, the project developer, to ensure that they are actually, working, the project out. 5 years. I mean, you could just sit there for 5 years and do nothing.
Okay. I'm going to wrap it there. The myriad inefficiencies and ways the Queensland planning system could be improved could take us on all night and into tomorrow, but we here in Brisbane need to go and get our rest before we turn up on the streets tomorrow morning to call for stronger EPBC reforms. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming along. We will send you an email tomorrow with a lot of links that we've talked about today and the recording of this webinar, so that you can watch it in future or pass it on if you found it useful. And thank you so much, Naeem, for coming and sharing your knowledge of the intricacies of the Queensland planning system. We're so grateful to the EDO and you for making time tonight. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.